Good morning, everyone. This year's festival was made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, BCTV, the Downtown Brattleboro Alliance, the Hatch, Tim Mayo, the Stepansky Family Charitable Trust, the Thompson Trust, Vermont's Arts Council, the Vermont Community Foundation, the Vermont Humanities Council, Vermont Public Radio, and the Wyndham Foundation. We would also like to thank our advertisers and encourage you to support them. The festival is run entirely by volunteers, but we do have expenses, so we encourage you to make a donation at a donation box sometime this weekend or online at our website. Please take a moment to turn the ringer off your phone, but feel free to take pictures and post them online. You can use the camera, just don't have the ringer on. So I'm going to introduce Elizabeth Caitlin, who is the chairman of the board, she is going to introduce Ron Powers. She's the chairman of the board of the retreat. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Catlin, as Sandy said, here as board chair of the Brattleboro retreat, which I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, but if you don't know, the Brattleboro retreat is a psychiatric and addictions hospital here in Brattleboro. We've been here since 1834, and we're founded on the basis of humane treatment for mental illness. It is a great honor to be able to welcome Ron Powers because he's a great guy, but also because he's written a very important book, which some of you may have come to today's talk having already read. Like me, some of you have that pleasure in your future, because I really do believe the more of us who read this book, the faster things will change, and they are changing as we demand a little bit more of a more open, transparent, and compassionate approach to mental illness. So Ron Powers is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author. Even before this book, he won a Pulitzer Prize for criticism as a columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, and he's also received an Emmy Award for his work on CBS Sunday Morning. He has co-authored 2 #1 bestsellers, Flags of Our Fathers and True Compass, and another biography of Mark Twain that was a bestseller on his own called Mark Twain, A Life. Ron was born in Hannibal, Missouri, the hometown of Mark Twain, so there's a deep connection there. We've been fortunate, though, to have him bringing his strengths and skills to our life here in Vermont. For a number of years, he's taught for the Breadloaf Writers Conference at Middlebury College, and he and his wife currently live in Castleton, Vermont with their son, Dean. I don't think I have to tell you that the name of the book he will be reading from today is called No One Cares About Crazy People, which is a kind of a heartbreaking title, but so abundantly true. The chaos and heartbreak of mental health care in America. And I read Ron's book this spring. We obviously, in our work at the retreat, are caring for people every day, but I think as we sit here in kind of literary congregation, we all know that we don't have to look very far in any of our own families to find someone who suffered some form of mental illness, psychiatric trauma, or addiction. And what I loved about Ron's book is that he brought that common humanity on this issue right to the fore by turning a very sharp and clear lens on the way fear and ignorance have informed our treatment of mental illness in our country, and how they continue to inform it today, with the story of his son Kevin and Dean, both of whom struggled with schizophrenia, and reminds us in both the information portion of the book and the family portion of the book how this love and pain and fear and uncertainty and misunderstanding and confusion should not get in the way of us giving the best possible care we can to the members of our human family who suffer from mental illness. So it is a great pleasure to have Ron here. He's going to speak for about 25 minutes, after which we hope to have a robust question and answer session. And then after that is done, we invite everyone back to the room through there, where there will be books to sign and refreshments served and the opportunity for more conversation. So please help me welcome Ron to the podium. Again, we are so honored that he's with us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I almost stepped into a chasm. Thank you all for coming. I'm very touched by this turnout, and good morning. I'm going to read from the preface to No One Cares About Crazy People, which will explain the title to those of you who may not know it. I'm going to read it because this is a literary festival, and writing this book called me to some important writerly decisions that went far beyond simply the gathering of information about the history, the nosology, the politics, the ideologies that surround serious mental illness. It's another way of saying a physical brain disease as opposed to depression and unhappiness. So I'll talk about those. Luckily, these are explained in the preface. So I'll start reading it to you. In the dreams and night thoughts that roiled in me for years after schizophrenia attacked my sons and killed one of them, dreams and thoughts that revisit me still, I have sometimes imagined my own sanity as resting on the surface of a membrane, a thin and fragile membrane that can easily be ripped open, plunging me into an abyss of madness, where I join the tumbling souls whose membranes have likewise been pierced through the ages. Sometimes, when my thoughts are especially fevered, I can envision the agent of this piercing. It is a watchful presence at the edge of things, silent and dripping, a stranger in a raincoat. He is interested mostly in the young, but he can strike at any time through the tissue that surrounds our sanity. When we fall into such psychosis, there are no other membranes to catch and protect us, and the horror and helplessness of the fall are intensified by an uncaring world. These are lurid images, I admit. Yet humankind has always called upon such imagery, symbol, myth, and metaphor to make an accounting of madness, because madness in itself is visible only in its effects. Thus we have horned demons, thought to invade and dwell inside the head, skulls of 10,000-year vintage, unearthed from grave sites of different societies around the world, reveal the same small holes, bored or cut, it is thought, to release such spirits from their tortured hosts. Thus we witness the recurring depiction through the ages of psychotic madness as demonic possession and transformation, the shape-shifting from ordinary human to savage beast, the fanged werewolf, emerging from human form under the full moon to prowl the landscape in Satan's service. Similarly, the vampire, the witch, the warlock, the monstrous Mr. Hyde. The madness metaphors are shot through with fear and loathing, and they have impelled human society to centuries of actual, non-metaphoric persecution of the mentally ill. Those among us who were believed to be mad have been imprisoned in basements and in fortress-like asylums. In the Dark Ages and before and after, they were beaten and burned at the stake. They have been locked in chains, in bedlams, sometimes for decades, taunted by the guards, starved, left to go naked. or in rags, forced to sleep on mattresses soaked with their accumulating urine, and put upon displays on Sundays for the paid amusement of visitors. The Enlightenment added more sophisticated remedies. When the mad were belted into chairs and spun around rapidly, leeched, bled nearly dry, forced to swallow mercury and chloride, and drenched with scalding or frigid water. And then came the 20th century, when things got bad. The 1900s brought totalitarianism to bear upon the insane. It delivered lobotomization and attempts at wholesale eradication via eugenics, which promised to rid mankind of its defectives by neutering or eliminating those who show signs of madness, weakness, or deformity, thus purifying the race. Nazi scientists can claim full credit for using the bodies, the living bodies of mentally ill prisoners, for human experimentation. But the United States is not morally exempt from those crimes against humanity. In fact, it was rock-solid Yankee businessmen who first popularized eugenic theories that turned human beings into mad science experiments. Such infamous tampering stigmatized those theories, and they receded from public attention, yet eugenics never went away. The practice resurfaced in the 1970s via the agribusiness-driven development gene therapy of food crops to arrest hereditary diseases such as cystic fibrosis, this is in humans, and Huntington's disease. And in 2013, the perfection of a genome editing technology known as CRISPR, it's an acronym, made it possible to recognize and replace faulty cells. A year later, scientists in China adapted CRISPR to, quote, engineer 2 monkeys targeted for their mutations. In 2015, and again in 2016, separate research groups in China announced that they had modified or edited genes in human embryos for health-related purposes. The implications of renewed attempts to perfect the human brain are clear, especially among the insane. In the years after World War II came the problematic panacea of the so-called wonder drugs. This rush of antipsychotic and psychotropic medications are intended to control the symptoms of schizophrenia or bipolarity, yet not the diseases themselves. Pardon me, please. They work by regulating flaws in certain chemicals in the brain, such as serotonin and dopamine, which affect behavior. Sometimes they work wonderfully and restore patients to functioning, if not completely to normal lives. Yet psychotropics remain far from perfect and have caused much inadvertent harm via misdosage and debilitating side effects. Wonder drugs and their salesmen disastrously coaxed our leaders, our political leaders in government, health, and business to talk themselves into an historic and massive blunder of mental health care, social policy, the shuttering of in-residence mental institutions, closing them down, first on the West Coast, and exiling the patients, presumably medicated, into the streets. This historic blunder has a name that grotesquely fits in with the elegance of its design and effects. Does anyone know the name? Deinstitutionalization. Sounds like a tray of silverware falling downstairs. That's about what it is. Deinstitutionalization uprooted what meager stability insane people clung to, the dismal care of state asylums, and drove tens of thousands into the streets, where they pioneered an entirely new urban subpopulation, the accursed demographic of the mad that we call the homeless. The sudden mass visibility and eccentric behavior of the homeless made them helpless before a resurgence, of demonization of a scale and intensity not seen since the Dark Ages. Now the police round them up, from the adolescents just emerging bewildered into insanity, to the veterans of madness, who are all often prone not just to mental illness, but to the injustices that compound it. Minority racial status, class disability, crabbed opportunity, inadequate medical care, and family instability. The police round them up for their abject crimes, the crime of survival, for robberies for food and the self-destructive medication of illicit drugs, for loitering, for vagrancy, for they round them up for street harassments, which sometimes happen, for bothering non-insane people with their monologues and declarations, for not having homes. What a crime that is. Bereft of committed support from any quarter, they live marginal, miserable lives and die early deaths. As for those few, and I stress few, schizophrenics who commit acts of horrific violence in psychotic states, they too are rounded up. They are found guilty in criminal court and ordered not to a mental hospital against their irrational will, for that would be a violation of their civil liberties. They are ordered instead, in most cases, to prison or to one of our great sprawling metropolitan jails, where their civil liberties entitled them to beatings and rape by their fellow inmates, beatings and tauntings by the guards, solitary confinement that drives them madder still, deprivation of prescription drugs for those few who had prescriptions, roasting or freezing in their cells by manipulated temperature, murder by guards, fellow inmates, or despair-induced suicide. Or if rounding up is too much of a challenge to law enforcement, they can simply be shot dead on the street or in their homes. I saw him reach for something. Whether locked in asylums or wandering the streets, for centuries, those who have been struck by madness have always had their own cruel nomenclature to bear, names intended to separate them out, divide us from them. Lunatics, imbeciles, loonies, dips, weirdos, wackos, schizos, psychos, freaks, fruitcakes, nutcases, nutjobs, wingnuts, cranks. The mad one, then, is something between a clown and a demon. Unless that mad one is a gift of God made flesh. Madness, defined as demonic possession, has its counter metaphor. Holy madness describes the behavior of many God-seeking individuals from time past into time present. From the tantric shithas of 18th century India, with their extravagant beliefs in divine attainment through ecstasy, Joan of Arc, leading the French army to the liberation of Orleans in the thrall of blinding white lights and the voices of French saints. Sir Winston Churchill, whose oratory in the dark days and darker nights during Britain's ordeal in World War II, President John Kennedy said of this oration. He mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. Was Winston Churchill a kind of shaman? The Bible is saturated with episodes and visions and characters that might have emerged from the pages of Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Disembodied voices of prophecy, flashes of blinding light, a burning bush, a sea that parts, righteous murder, ladders to heaven, transubstantiation, reincarnation, a bodily ascent into the sky, the book of Revelation's entire. All are paramount among the sacred textual evidence of the Christian God. Moses is called into the mountains of Midian by a divine voice, returns with the 10 Commandments, the sixth of which stipulates, "Thou shalt not kill," and at once orders the execution of 3,000 idolaters. Abraham journeys into the land of Moriah with his son Isaac in tow for the purpose of slaying the unsuspecting boy as a test of his faith in God, only to spare the child at the last minute thanks to a heavenly voice. The angel of the Lord has been convinced of Abraham's faith. And the Bible's concluding book is a vision of judgment so intricate, elaborate, and grandiose that if it were told by a patient in a psych ward of a modern hospital, it would likely prompt a prescription. Now, I want everybody here to understand that I am not trying to be disrespectful of religion. I am trying to demonstrate the similarities between what we consider divine prophecy and what mad people often experience as prophecy. If evil madness and godly madness formed a dialectic through history, a third interpretive force arose in the mid-20th century to dismiss each of these opposing dogmas with equally appropriate iciness and contempt. This third force rebuffs the metaphoric category of angels and demons, along with the work-in-progress science that seeks to explain and treat schizophrenia. It denies that schizophrenia exists at all. While the belief that mental illness is a myth has lacked the backing of accepted science, it quickly aroused a large and passionate following that encouraged the deinstitutionalization movement, blunted the momentum of accelerating breakthroughs in the identification and humane treatment of the mentally ill, maimed the cultural prestige of psychiatry, and justified legal obstacles in the emergency care and treatment of people in psychosis. My family and I have witnessed this denialism in person, in action. It arises from a seductive appeal to individual rights and constitutional freedoms. But as the psychiatrist Jonathan Edwards has told me, denialism also is rooted in what he believes is primal fear. He thought for a moment as he talked to me, and then he continued, "I think primal fear is the origin regarding mental illness of all the misinformation, the projections, the denial, the blaming of the victim or the patient, the lack of empathy toward the sufferers, treating adolescents as criminals, cutting budgets for treatment centers, all of it. Human beings are terrified of this disease, and they try to deny it out of existence." Now, most of us accept the basic, grievous medical truth of schizophrenia and do not deny that the disease exists. And it is likely we will not ascribe to a mentally ill person the voice of God or angels, nor will most of us believe that he or she is possessed by evil spirits. Yet while the holiness and denial remain powerful and influential means of interpreting or dismissing madness, we still do demonize the mentally ill. Demonization remains the mode of history and our time. It may never have enjoyed the cachet and the freedom from accountability that it does now. In our era, in our country, mentally ill people suffer and die because of our fear. 11:30. I just accidentally read you chapter 1. Trust me. The preface is brief, and at the risk of imposing on your kindness, it's pretty brief, and I'll try to get through it fast, but it really does set the stage for my book, and I would love for you to hear it. So, will you indulge me for a few more minutes? Thank you very much. I start with an epigraph. I have come to present to you the strong claims of suffering humanity. I come as the advocate of the helpless, forgotten, insane men and women, held in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, and pens, naked, chained, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. I beg, I implore you to put away the spirit of selfishness and self-seeking. Lay off the armor of local strife and political ambition. Forget, I beg you, the earthly, the perishable, the thought without mercy. Gentlemen, I commit you to a sacred cause. Anyone know who said those words? It was Dorothea Dix, the great social reformer of the 19th century. She wrote them to the Massachusetts state legislature in December 1842. She had to write them out because girls couldn't talk to the legislature back then. Here's the second part of my epigraph. No one cares about crazy people. This was written in a memo by a woman named Kelly M. Rindfleisch, who was then deputy chief of staff to the Milwaukee County executive, who was then trying to contain a scandal in a mental hospital in Wisconsin, and whose name was Scott Walker. The memo was written in 2010, and it provided the necessary irritant for me to plunge ahead with this book when the going got tough. And here is the preface. This is the book that I promised myself I would never write, and promised my wife as well. I have kept that promise for a decade, since our younger son, Kevin, hanged himself in our basement a week before his 21st birthday in July 2005, after struggling for 3 years with schizophrenia. The promise was easy to keep in the first 5 years after Kevin's death, if only because I could not bring myself to think about such a project and the revisiting that it would make necessary. I wasn't able to think about much of anything, except that I dreaded each new season of greening up, as it is called here in Vermont. It's a tragically beautiful summer my wife Honoree managed to observe not long after that terrible July had passed. Over the second 5, the infernal process of healing, adaptation really, had begun its unwelcome sterilizing work. And then the malady struck our family again. Symptoms of schizophrenia surfaced in our elder and surviving son, Dean. My wife and I witnessed his psychotic break on a Christmas morning that sent him knocking on doors through the neighborhood, announcing that he was the Messiah, until a police officer restrained him, gently, thank God, and took him to a nearby medical center. Dean stubbornly resisted and surmounted the disease's worst effects and is functioning pretty well at this writing. Still, this second of 2 unthinkable blows to our family added to a list of reasons that I felt should impel me to leave the subject alone. At the top of the list was privacy. My sons, even as robust and outgoing children, had discretion, which they inherited from their mother. None of these three were what you would call hearts on sleeves people. It wasn't a matter of secretiveness. Some things were just nobody else's business, that's all. When Kevin, our younger son, was away with his guitar at a music academy in Michigan, Interlochen, he emailed us a photograph of himself and his date for the spring dance. Kevin was wearing a white dinner jacket, his first. I was moved to use the photo as the basis of a commentary I wrote for Vermont Public Radio. Quote, into the piece. The image of a white dinner jacket, especially one worn by a 15-year-old son 900 miles from home on a spring night at the prom with a very young woman on his arm. This image takes on a new and unexpected luster, a sweetness and fragility so unbearable that you lie there in your bed wishing that the damned alarm clock would go off and restore you to the necessary cynicism of daylight. One of Kevin's buddies back in Middlebury, where we lived, heard the commentary and ratted me out. Kevin let me know that he was wise to me, what I'd done, in terms that you might think were used against somebody who had stolen his guitar. So privacy was the top consideration, and I suppose it should have sufficed. But there were other reasons, strong ones. The moral blemish of exploitation, for one. Even when exploitation is not the intended motive in a book, such as this, it can seem the unintended consequence. My sons were and remain sacred to me. They are not for sale. Then there is self-pity. I hate self-pity. I always have. I cannot read books that traffic in self-pity. I have shocked my writing students at times, I'm afraid, by informing them that their essays or short stories of woe were not acceptable, no matter the quality. Characters in books, whether fiction or nonfiction, who are presented only in the context of boohoo and who have no means of liberating themselves from the boohoo, are not characters I want to spend time with. The great novelist and teacher of writing, John Gardner, the late John Gardner, had a withering dismissal for such books, victim fiction. I never asked, but I suspect he dismissed victim nonfiction as well. So no self-pity. And really, at the end of the day, who the hell wants to read about schizophrenia anyway? Not me. And that was the way things stood for the second 5 years. That is the way I thought things would stand for the duration. I was just not interested. But to paraphrase Tolstoy, you may not be interested in schizophrenia, but schizophrenia is interested in you. Schizophrenia is a chronic and incurable disease of the brain. It is rooted partly in genetic mutation and partly in external or environmental experiences. It is the most dreaded of all human mental illnesses, afflicting slightly more than 1 in 100 people. Since I wrote the preface, that estimation has gone up to about 4 in 100. Its name, a bit misleading as we shall see, is a vernacular synonym for its closely allied affliction, schizoaffective disorder. The latter disease is rarer, striking about 0.3% of the population, but worse, given that it incorporates severe mood swings and paranoia, as well as the loss of touch with reality, wrought by schizophrenia. Kevin had schizoaffective disorder. My son's ordeals and the disease's unequaled menace justify schizophrenia as the focus of inquiry for this book. It is a scourge apart from other mental illnesses that sprawl across many categories, lengths of duration, and degrees of severity. The World Health Organization estimates that 1/4 of the globe's population will experience some kind of mental illness in their lifetimes. 2/3 of these either do not recognize that they are ill or simply refuse treatment. Studies by the National Institute of Mental Health show that among Americans 18 and older, more than 62 million, 26% of the population, require but are not always given counseling and medical treatment. A familiar claim among social scientists is that Americans are overdiagnosed and overmedicated, not just for mental problems, but for emotional and physical complaints as well. A fair amount of the blame for this is ascribed to the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association. Its 5th edition, which came out in May 2013, contained 991 pages, and it triggered passionate debate over whether its authors were elevating what Sigmund Freud called ordinary unhappiness, or the claims of the worried well. This debate is important and will be examined further in the book, but for present purposes, it is irrelevant. Schizophrenia stands unique in its capacity to wreck the rational processes of the mind. It is to mental health what cancer is to physical health, a predator without peer and impervious to care. Now, the rest of the preface describes an experience profoundly transformative for me that happened here in Vermont, and it's fairly short. My resolve to refrain from writing this book came unraveled on the night of January 30th, 2014. In the late afternoon of that day, Honoree and I drove from our home in Castleton to the Vermont State Capitol in Montpelier. We'd been invited to testify at a public hearing convened by the Senate Committee on Health and Welfare. The hearing was called to air out arguments on either side of a bitter, seemingly intractable clash of ideologies. In fact, the most debilitating dispute to have bedeviled public policy regarding mentally ill people over the last 60 years. The clash places in opposition two values which, in the abstract, are both beyond reproach. One is an individual's right to proper and prompt and timely emergency care. The other, and I refer to it in chapter 1, the other is an individual's civil liberty. At specific issue was a bill supported by Governor Peter Shumlin, designed to shorten the waiting time between emergency room arrival and the onset of medical treatment for a person suffering severe mental illness, particularly if such a person is resisting such treatment. Treatment generally means retaining such a person in an emergency room until a psychiatric bed becomes available, and medicating the patient with psychotropic drugs. Neurological research supports the view that early intervention, for those of you who may be struggling with a relative, early intervention is necessary to prevent the psychosis from deepening. These interventions become involuntary from the patient's point of view if the patient refuses to give consent. In Vermont, as in other states, involuntary patients can be placed in emergency rooms but cannot receive ongoing medication for their affliction without a court order authorizing the doctor to proceed. Some Vermont patients have waited in their psychoses as long as 2 and even 3 months for the case to work its way through the courts, my son Dean included. At first glance, speedy involuntary treatment might seem the least objectionable of measures, given that people in psychosis are virtually never capable of making rational decisions, by definition. And yet, opponents of the process, whose ranks are reinforced, sadly, by schizophrenia victims, bring passionate counter-arguments to the debate. Among the most formidable is that involuntary treatment is, by definition, a violation of one's civil liberties and of one's irreducible control of the self. This objection is rooted in antipathy toward the power of the state over the individual. Some of its intellectual architects were European emigres who had close knowledge of atrocities visited upon helpless prisoners by mid-century totalitarian regimes. And some of it is rooted in an evil companion disease called anosognosia, lack of insight, which prevents a victim of brain disease from understanding that he or she is a victim, and which the book will examine later. The hearing at Montpelier richly showcased both sides of this historic disagreement. The state's old tradition of civil discourse held tempers in check, but strong passion informed nearly every word on either side. Honoree and I testified briefly in alliance with those advocating for shorter waits for involuntary treatment. The state legislature debated the bill through the spring, and in June, the governor signed a version of it containing several compromises into law. My purpose in bringing up this hearing and legislation is not to re-argue its merits or demerits. My purpose is to describe the awakening the event triggered in me. I discussed my reactions with Honoree as we walked out of the chamber and the Capitol to our car, and discovered that hers were similar. I had found myself moved, riveted by the people who spoke against involuntary treatment. They sat in an uncomfortable line at the long, polished table in the committee chamber, clearing their throats and stealing glances at the suited and scarved and coiffed legislative committee members on the other side. Here were the people about, quote, whom no one cares. They had come dressed in the Vermont uniform of workaday jeans and flannel shirts and denim skirts. Many of the women with their hair uncombed and men with their beards untrimmed. Their voices sometimes quavered and their handwritten notes trembled in their grip. Yet they were there. The faces and the souls of the mentally ill, emerging from their prevailing invisibility to declare themselves. The sheer presence of them, their actualization in the room, had affected me in the gut, not because I hadn't expected them, but because of the profound elemental humanity of them. Full realization dawned on me only later. Like so many people, I had converted the mentally ill into abstractions. I had stopped seeing them. I'd looked away reflexively when I did see them. I'd stopped thinking about them. I had stopped acknowledging their chimerical presence at the corners of my tight little sphere of reality. How thunderously ironic. I, who had witnessed mental illness in as intimate and convincing a form as possible, I, who had wept, sat unmoving, endured years of dreams, including the most exquisitely, diabolically sweet dream that an agitated human mind could concoct. A recurring dream of Kevin alive, but refusing ever again to play his guitar. I, of all people, was shocked to behold mentally ill folks in corporal form. So I'll hurry to the finish. In tackling the infinitely layered and complicated topic of mental illness, I am treading a path that hundreds of writers with far better credentials than I have traveled. Neuroscientists with expertise in schizophrenia's evolving nosology, scholars who have retraced its long history and the long history of mankind's attempts to understand and conquer it, or alternatively to render it invisible by throwing those afflicted with it into dungeons where atrocities were the norm. From a little farther back in contemporary history, there looms the vexing colossus of Thomas Szasz, the dapper and courtly Hungarian émigré, psychiatrist and anti-psychiatrist. Szasz's brilliantly crafted iconoclasm was expressed in papers and talks in 36 books, beginning with The Myth of Mental Illness in 1961, and it dealt psychiatry a destabilizing blow from which it has never fully recovered. I had planned for a while to write my book from a distance, confining it to a survey of mental illness's historic contours and the efforts and impediments of the last century and a half to understand it. Yet a hard and humiliating truth arose in my path and would not budge. The truth was that such a book would have been hollow, redundant at best, with the many good expositional books on the subject in and out of print, useless at worst. It would have meant the squandering of a chance, my last and only chance, to make common cause with the untold numbers of people maimed by psychotic attack upon either themselves or a beloved friend or relative. By opening up my intensely private family's loss and suffering, I hope to achieve two goals. One goal is to persuade my fellow citizens in the schizophrenic nation that their ordeals, while awful, are neither unique to them nor the occasion for shame and withdrawal. The other is to demonstrate to those who fear and loathe crazy people that these victims are not typically weak or immoral or unhappy or in any other way undeserving of full personhood. On the contrary, like my adored sons, Dean Paul Powers and Kevin Powers, they tend to be people who have known love, laughter, inventiveness, hope, the capacity to dream the same dreams of a future that other people dream. That they have been maimed by a scourge of inexplicable, malign destructiveness is not their fault. Well, there is a third goal. That goal is to preserve what is possible to preserve in words of the lives and soaring souls of Dean and Kevin. Another term for this goal is consecration. One more page. Finally, no one cares about crazy people as a call to arms on behalf of those people for any society that dares describe itself as decent. America must turn its immense resources and energy and conciliatory goodwill to a final assault on mental illness. My sons and your afflicted children and brothers and sisters and families deserve nothing less. The passionate, afflicted people who testified in that hearing in Vermont in January 2014 deserve nothing less. I hope you do not enjoy this book. I hope you are wounded by it, wounded as I have been in writing it, wounded to act, to intervene. Only if this happens and keeps happening until it needs happen no more, can we dare to hope that Dean and Kevin and all their brothers and sisters in psychotic suffering are redeemed, that they have not suffered entirely in vain. Thank you. In here, and I've rambled for a long time, but I'll take some questions if you have them. Yes, I'm deaf.
Is there a country or countries that might be considered models for inpatient treatment of mentally ill?
Can somebody up close amplify that for me, please?
Is there if there's a country or countries that have model inpatient treatment for the mentally ill?
I can't guarantee you that I know any offhand. I've heard that Switzerland, which is good at everything, has some model programs. I think it's worth a Google. I'm sorry, I could pretend, but I don't know of any. Anyone else? Yes.
You didn't say anything on the side of people who resist treatment about the difficulties with medication.
There are, well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, all the many difficulties with medication. It's not panacea.
Medication is a very dicey solution. Schizophrenia is a very dicey disease. I devote a chapter to the abuses of Big Pharma, the phoniness of some of their products, their overcharging, the claims they have settled for millions, in one case nearly $1 billion with the government. It's not a clean alternative, but when meds work, they work. They can bring a person back to some kind of stability, and that is why, on balance, I advocate medications, carefully supervised and switched if necessary. I thank all of you for coming here today.